California existence.
Honestly, I know. Everyone, we'll start here in just a moment. I see a lot of folks are logging in now, so we'll hold off for another minute. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I still see people flying in. That's fine. We are recording this session. We'll post it up onto our YouTube channel at the conclusion, and I will send out a link to all registrants with the recording link. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio. I'm so happy to be here with Eric Anderson, our chapter president, and Nolan Gray. So this is our 2023 State Planning Conference opening keynote speaker, take two. So we're so happy to have you here. If you have questions for Nolan, type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end. We have some time blocked off for questions and answers. So go ahead and type them in and then I'll be sure to get those over to Nolan during the Q&A so we can have that conversation with him. Eric, I'm going to kick it over to you to give an introduction to Nolan.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Anderson, your APA Ohio chapter president. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you all are as excited as I am to hear from our keynote speaker, Nolan Gray. So a little bit about Nolan. So Nolan is a professional city planner and an expert in urban land use regulation. He's currently completing a PhD in urban planning at University of California, Los Angeles. He previously worked on the front lines of zoning as a planner in New York City and now serves as an affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he advises state and local policymakers on land use policy. Nolan is a contributor to Market Urbanism and a widely published author with work appearing in outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg, City Lab, The Guardian, and The Guardian. Gray earned his Master of City and Regional Planning degree at Rutgers University and has a bachelor's in philosophy and political science at the Mercatus Center at George Washington University. He lives in Los Angeles, California, and is originally from Lexington, Kentucky, so our neighbor to the south. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nolan. There's a lot of movement and progress regarding zoning reform in the US, so particularly in relation to equity. And so our keynote speaker is very timely. Christine really loves his book. So one of the reasons why we brought him on as a speaker as well. So looking forward to hearing your story and your message today, Nolan. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Eric, for the introduction. And thank you, Christine, for setting this up. It's fantastic to be speaking with everybody. As folks suggested here, I was supposed to give this talk a couple months ago, and I got a terrible flu. It was a shame. I'd actually planned to spend a whole week in Columbus. It's one of my favorite cities. In any case, it's a pleasure to be chatting with folks who are on the front lines of these issues in a state that's near and dear to my heart. We'll go ahead and jump right into it. Let's find the slides here. Oh, sorry. Is that right? That was the right. Perfect. Let's move this over here. And you all can see the slides okay?
Yes, looks good. Oh, perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Today, we're going to be talking about legalizing housing abundance in Ohio. This is related to my current work as the research director for California YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard, where we are hard at work trying to make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. As some of you might have heard, we deal with minor housing affordability challenges here in California, but the issues that we're dealing with here in California over the last few years have really gone nationwide. And I think we're now at a moment where we really need to be having a national conversation about zoning reform. Let's set the table a little bit. 10 years ago, we had a thing called a housing bubble, some alleged, just over 10 years, actually. Home prices hit historic highs. It was very scary. And then prices bottom out around 2012. Over the past 10 years, this is what's happened. In states like Ohio, home prices have nearly doubled in price in real terms. Concurrently, vacancy rates have fallen. In this case, it looks like they've nearly halved in Ohio from a very healthy, very amenable to renters, 11% down to about just over 5%. Still not quite so bad as we have it here in California, but trending in a very negative direction when it comes to making sure that folks can have access to decent, affordable housing. As home prices continue to go up and rents continue to go up, more and more households find themselves in a situation where, in addition to homes just getting more expensive, they're not able to save month to month the money needed to potentially make a down payment. And that's why we're seeing in Ohio, as in so many states, homeownership rates hit their lowest recorded level, essentially pulling up the ladder and locking the next generation of American families out of the American dream. That's probably the good scenario for many families. Alternatively, we're seeing incredible rises in homelessness all across the country. This was, again, something that had mostly been limited to states like California or really expensive places in the Northeast, and now it affects almost every single state in the country. You have folks who unable to find an affordable home near where they live are taking to sleeping in their car or undertaking super commutes. And while super commutes might sound good, might sound like a superhero, you do not want a super commute. These are folks spending 2-3 hours in their car every single day. And the numbers don't really tell the whole story there. A worker spending 2 or 3 hours a day in their car is in potentially evenings or mornings that they can't spend with children or loved ones. That's time that they can't spend taking evening classes or pursuing their hobbies. The lifestyle implications of folks having to drive further and further out to find affordable housing are pretty hard to overstate. At the same time that we're losing ground on housing affordability, we're also making slower and slower progress on rectifying historical patterns of segregation, both along income and race. Indeed, on some margins, things actually seem to be trending in the wrong direction. Within cities, while integration has improved within cities, among cities and many metro areas, segregation, both along racial and socioeconomic lines, is getting worse. And again, as we try to rectify historical wrongs, closing the homeownership gap between white and black households is absolutely key. We know that the wealth gap is largely a function of gaps in homeownership rates, and we have not done a very good job of closing that. And as home prices continue to rise, and if we continue to not build the starter home typologies that get people on the ladder of homeownership, that gap is just going to keep increasing. Of course, there are some places where we can allow growth. In Ohio, as in my home state of Kentucky, as here in California, it's fairly easy to go out and build on the periphery. If you want to go out to the edge of the metropolitan area, maybe an hour and a half drive, 2 hours away from job centers, and throw up tract housing and a commercial strip with a giant parking lot, we ironically make that fairly easy to do. And this has essentially been the growth trajectory of nearly all of our cities across the country. Las Vegas is a particularly dramatic example, but essentially we've said, yes, we'll allow our cities to grow on some margins. We recognize we need more housing. We recognize we need more starter homes in particular, but it's all going to go on the periphery. And I think as many folks on this call know, that can be fiscally and environmentally unsustainable. Of course, there's this famous graphic of Cuyahoga County here. This is, again, not beating up on Cleveland necessarily, but this is something that's happened all across the country. Was nearly all of the growth has taken the form of outward horizontal expansion. So we have these four concurrent crises, as I argue in my book. We have a mounting housing affordability crisis. We have a crisis of limiting access to economic opportunity. We have this crisis of slowing or even reversing progress on racial equity. And we have this crisis of sustainability of our growth patterns. The good news is that these crises, in a certain way, are a policy choice. Now, normally I'm curious. I think most people here probably have some basic familiarity with zoning. Some of you, I'll probably look at maps like this all day, every day, as I used to do in the Department of City Planning in New York. I sympathize. But as I argue in my book, I think it's absolutely essential that we understand the role of zoning policies in contributing to and potentially exacerbating these four concurrent crises. Now, those of you who work all day, every day with zoning, I don't have much to tell you. You're going to know a lot of this. But for the planners on the call, I think it's who work maybe in other fields, it's important to understand exactly what zoning is doing. So there's two pillars to zoning. The first is use segregation. So taking every single parcel in every single city and saying, here are the assigned land uses. And most people, if you've even played SimCity, right, you know, residential, commercial, industrial. Of course, if you've ever cracked open a zoning code, you know, it gets to be much, much more complex. There will be different types of residential zones that allow different types of homes. In certain residential neighborhoods, you'll only be able to have one type of home and in another, a different type of home. The same is true of commercial districts. We have multiple different commercial districts that will have long lists of all of the hypothetically allowed uses. And as you dig more into this, you see it's quite a bit different from, I think, the normal justification that we hear for zoning. Certainly that we get the, you know, get the clean planning school origins of zoning, that, you know, this was about keeping factories out of cul-de-sacs. As the image on the right shows, this is from a 1950s zoning document, but could very well be true of nearly every city today. There's a social project embedded in this of what a correct home looks like, based on what a correct family looks like, and in turn, what a correct neighborhood looks like. Here you can see, of course, certain very normative decisions being made about what type of family should live in what type of house. In addition to use segregation, zoning also has a lot of rules that regulate the density that's allowed on any given lot. So most people know about things like height limits. Maybe they know about things like front yards. But there are also complex rules like floor area ratios or lot coverage rules that heavily shape the amount of housing or office space that can be built on any given parcel. And as I'll argue later on, in many cases, these rules are quite strict, especially in urban areas. Another important thing that I like to set up in explaining what I think's gone wrong with zoning is that zoning has become quite a bit more complex. So if you look at some of the early zoning codes, I think the original New York City zoning resolution was maybe a dozen pages, written in relatively plain, accessible English, to the extent that zoning can be accessible. On the left here is a zoning map for a specific area of Queens as recently as 1961. So this was when New York City did a giant overhaul of its zoning code. You can see, you know, what we have here, giant R6 areas, giant R5 areas. Those hatched polygons are commercial overlays along corridors. On the right, you can see the zoning map as I was tasked with implementing it in 2021, I believe. It's probably become slightly more complex in the last 2 years. Here you can see it looks quite a bit more complex, and the same thing is happening with our zoning ordinances. These documents that started out as maybe being a dozen pages are now thousands of pages, potentially, documents that a normal person essentially has to require a planner or an attorney to interpret, or zoning maps that have incredible granularity, in many cases bumping into zoning districts that are invented for specific parcels. This complexity has made the system, to a certain extent, inherently somewhat exclusionary. But sometimes that exclusion is fairly explicit. So as I argue in the book, the intersection between zoning and housing affordability works in two ways. The first is the zoning codes that we have on the books today often just make it illegal to build certain types of housing. So for example, here on the left is the municipal boundaries for Los Angeles. yes, Los Angeles has very weird municipal boundaries. If you'd like to understand why, you should go watch Chinatown with Jack Nicholson. But in any case, anything that's colored on this image is an area either purple or blue, is an area where the city has said residential is appropriate here. Residential is allowed. It's fine. There's no health or safety concerns. We're not reserving it for industry. But in all of the pink areas, the only form of housing that you can legally build under Los Angeles's local zoning code is a detached single family home. So we've essentially, like so many other cities, Los Angeles is very typical in this regard. Like nearly every other major American city, we've said in 75 to 90, or in some suburbs, 100% of our residential areas, the only type of housing we're going to allow is a detached single family home, maybe on a 5,000, 7,500, 10,000 square foot lot. What that means is that historical typologies like what you see here, I think a very tasteful duplex, looks like it might potentially be a fourplex with some additional units in the back, is illegal. And the only thing you can build in the vast majority of our residential areas in Los Angeles, as in so many other cities, is a detached single family home. I will let you make your own conclusions about the design quality of this particular home, but in any case, it's not doing us any favors from an affordability perspective. The same thing with some of these use rules. In many cases, cities still have commercial districts along all of our corridors or in our core commercial areas that don't actually allow the historical mixture of uses that was typical of commercial areas. So what we end up with is situations where we have, half-empty strip malls, office parks that will likely never be fully leased out in an age of even partial remote work. And it's illegal to take those properties and actually build apartments on them, or build townhouses, or build mixed-use communities on them. We're essentially locking portions of our city that are potentially least economically viable in a post-COVID world in amber. Where zoning rules don't altogether make housing illegal to build, in many cases, they can make housing more expensive to build. So of course, most people know, yeah, okay, Los Angeles has rules that drive up the cost of housing. Everybody knows that. But here's an example from Southeast Texas, which most people would think would be a pretty liberal, pro-development environment. And it's common that jurisdictions might have rules that say, if you are not going to plat a home on a 9,000 square foot lot, or an 8,000 square foot lot, or a 12,000 square foot lot, you are not allowed to build a home. And so what we're doing is we're essentially saying to prospective home buyers, if you don't want to consume a certain amount of land, or if you can't afford to consume a certain amount of land, you're not allowed to have a home here. And we found when we surveyed suburbs across Texas that even in this land abundant, fairly pro-growth state, these minimum lot size rules were actually placing a binding constraint and forcing lot sizes to be larger than consumers might potentially otherwise have preferred. Now, in contexts where you don't have water and sewer, of course, there might be a health and safety justification for requiring a minimum lot size. But in nearly all cases, we impose these rules in contexts where we actually have that infrastructure, and there's no real health or safety objective being advanced. Minimum lot size have that effect in cities for the most part, or sorry, suburbs and rural areas. In cities, a similar type of rule that often increases the cost of housing, giving potential prospective homeowners or renters no choice, are minimum parking requirements. So these are rules that essentially say, if you want to have an apartment, you have to have 2 parking spaces, 1 parking space per bedroom. If you want to build office space, maybe you have to have 1 parking space per 400, 600, 1,000 square feet of commercial space. What these rules do, as with minimum lot sizes, they essentially say, if you're not going to engage in some level of consumption that we've deemed appropriate, even untethered from health or safety considerations, you are not allowed to have a certain type of home. And now, of course, many people will want parking spaces. In many cases, when we get rid of minimum parking requirements, developers still continue to build parking. They might build slightly less than had been previously required. Over time, we see those numbers come down. But many renters and homeowners might demand parking, and it would still get built. But if you take, for example, the case on the right here, a 2-bedroom, 675 square foot apartment, exactly the types of, if this is a condo, exactly the types of starter homes that we need to be building today. Let's say this unit was built in an area where it's highly walkable, or the residents would have easy access to transit, and you require that apartment come with 2 parking spaces. You're requiring that household consume nearly twice as much space, and that they consume almost as much space in parking as they do in living area. And that can increase the cost of a new unit by 30, 50, $75,000, depending on if there's excavation work, if it's in a parking structure, if it's in a parking lot. In any case, it's a similar issue where the zoning rules are essentially saying the house has to be at least a certain price. I would say too, especially pertinent in places like Ohio, where there's an amazing historical uh, building stock that is, I think now in many places, certainly in my last trip in Cincinnati, there's incredible adaptive reuse and revitalization happening. But in many cases, those efforts bump up against these parking rules. So for example, in a typical US city under typical parking requirements, if you wanted to adaptively reuse either of these buildings here on the left, you would probably have to raise the other one to potentially build a parking lot. Now, would anybody think that that would improve that corridor? I certainly don't think so, and I would think most planners would agree. These rules can often be somewhat weird, a little bit funny. So for example, in the chart on the right, very typical minimum parking requirement chart, if you want to build a tavern or a pub, you have to have 10 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. If you want to build a small bar, it has to be 12 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. Or if it's a bar, lounge, or a club, it must be 14 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. If you know the distinction between these three things, congratulations, you might have a bright career in planning consulting. In any case, we are essentially requiring parking for 3 uses that exist to serve people alcohol and presumably get them inebriated. We are somewhat bizarrely writing potentially drunk driving into law. Other rules that I find amusing, you commonly will find, for example, a parking requirement for a pool that's based on the gallons of water in the pool, as if deeper pools generate more traffic, or inches of pew space in a church. These rules are really funny, and I would encourage folks who are interested in this to go check out the work of Donald Shue. Another really, really important part of the story, and it was certainly top of mind when I was writing the book in 2021, was the relationship between zoning and segregation. You know, sometimes this gets cast as an accidental or an unfortunate result of zoning or a misuse of zoning. But something that I try to stress, and I think if you look at the historical record, it's fairly clear. In many cases, these rules were being adopted fairly explicitly to achieve zoning. So modern zoning codes emerge in the 1920s, very shortly after the Supreme Court in 1917 outlawed explicitly racial zoning. And so in the aftermath of that decision, Buchanan v. Worley, what many cities start doing is adopting codes that never mention race. They never say white or black, as racial zoning codes had. But they say, well, if you want to live in this neighborhood, you have to be able to afford a single family home of at least this size, on a lot of at least this size. And the power to determine who gets to live where is ultimately the power, the power to determine what type of housing can be built where is ultimately the power to determine who gets to live where. And these codes that were fairly explicitly premised on segregating cities along the basis of incomes, and thus in the American context, along racial lines, are still on the books, almost completely unchanged. The irony is that I think a lot of people, even with stated progressive values, don't realize this. So for example, this is a photo that I took in Austin, Texas. Here on the left, we have these very nice signs. It's a very nice sentiment. The all are welcome here signs that started to emerge in the age of Trump. And then on the right is a sign protesting a set of zoning changes that would allow for more missing middle style multifamily housing to be built. So many Americans say they have progressive values. They support rectifying the historical injustices that still plague our cities. And then in their zoning policies pursue almost radically different outcomes. And I think it's important for us as planners to make that connection and to tell that story. Finally, on the environmental and sustainability connection here, the irony is that so many of our codes, as we reckon with climate change, and you crack open just about any general plan or comprehensive plan or master plan, today, climate change and being stewards of the environment will be front and center. And yet we have so many zoning rules that collectively make it hardest to build the most environmentally sustainable forms of housing. The forms of infill housing, housing that might, God forbid, share a wall, neighborhoods that might, God forbid, have a corner grocery that somebody might walk to for some of their daily trips. And yet we make it very, very easy to build the least sustainable patterns of development. Development that will consume a greenfield, that will involve everybody driving, that will involve the least energy efficient forms of housing. And again, I think it's reasonable that we have choice, that, you know, cities are naturally going to expand outward, and there's going to be a range of housing typologies. But if we make it incredibly difficult to build the energy efficient patterns of development on the left, and incredibly easy to make to build the energy inefficient patterns of development on the right, we're tipping the scales in a way that undermines our stated values and objectives. Another thing that's sort of gone off the rails with zoning, and I suppose I should have offered a trigger warning for any of the planners who have stood at the front of a room like the image on the right. This is potentially not a very pleasant experience. But what's happened with so many of our zoning codes is that because they've fallen so out of sync with reality, we've become dependent on discretionary permits for almost everything. So for those who aren't in the entitlement trenches, historically, the way that zoning was meant to work was that if you follow the rules, you check the boxes, you read the regulations and comply, you get your permit. But because those rules have become so strict and so out of sync with the reality of what needs to be built today, so many of our projects now depend on a discretionary relief mechanism. So a variance, or they require a rezoning, or they require a text amendment. This then opens up and politicizes almost every new project. We now have to have public hearings. In some states, we have to have environmental reports. It now has to go to council. These politicized processes, of course, just beyond delaying potentially inoffensive new development, can also easily be hijacked by a selective and often unrepresentative group of community members. We know from research that people who attend public hearings, and anybody who's ever been to a public hearing already intuitively knows this, we know that that's not a random selection of the community, and that often it's a selection of the community that tends to be wealthier, that is more likely to already own their home, and is much more likely to have anti-housing views than a randomly selected resident. And this is the NIMBY phenomenon, the phenomenon of folks who are able to show up at the Tuesday 10 a.m. hearing to speak out against housing. And then, of course, the people who never have a voice at these hearings are the people who might live in that housing. Or the people who almost never have a voice at these hearings are maybe the single working parent, or the person who's working overtime, or the person who's living in a shelter who doesn't have the privilege to be able to come to these meetings, and their voices don't get heard. I mentioned the delays here. Part of what's gone wrong again is all of these discretionary mechanisms depend on months of review that not only just delay projects, but they also consume a huge amount of planning capacity. So now, I mean, so many planning offices today spend huge amounts of their personnel and financial resources essentially processing these documents to allow for projects that if we were writing the zoning today would almost certainly be allowed as of right. But because we're beholden to the zoning code that was written 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago, we have to undertake this complex process. One more point here, and I've started adding this to my presentation because I think it's a really important point. This is an example from Los Angeles, so you'll want to adjust the prices. When I say starter home to a lot of elected officials, I find that they think of something like this, right? They think of a single family home on a discrete lot. Maybe in this Midwestern context, there would be a nice big green lawn out front, gabled roofs, etc. When they see this, they think luxury housing, luxury condos. This is for rich people. This is the source of our affordability problems. The irony, again, adjust these prices for regions. Both of these units are within blocks of each other here in Los Angeles. A identically sized 2-bedroom condo, actually slightly better, it's 2-bed, 2-bath condo in the brand new quote unquote luxury building. Maybe it has luxury amenities, right? Like maybe it has a workout room. Maybe 300 people share a workout room, so you know it's luxury. Those units are almost half the price of, I think, what a lot of folks still think of as a single family home. And it's important that we tell that story, because if we don't know what a single family home, or if we don't know what a starter home looks like, or a more accessible form of housing might look like, and if we don't communicate that to elected officials and decision makers, we are going to be stuck in a trap of never allowing the types of housing that might make housing more accessible. And again, $699,000 is still far too high, but you start building enough of these and the prices start to gradually fall. Okay, is everybody sufficiently depressed now? Everyone's sad? Get a cup of coffee here. The good news here, and this is what I really want to spend the remaining of the time on before we get to questions, is this is a crisis that we know how to end. And indeed, I think in so many contexts, planners are at the forefront of this, and I'm seeing so many more planners be leaders on this issue in their community. I'll talk about three paths to reform. The first is that local governments can and should remove a lot of these regulatory barriers to new housing production, especially at the more affordable levels of the market. Second, it's increasingly important for states and maybe even the federal government to put up guardrails or to create incentives for local planning to make the changes that we know need to happen to zoning policies. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about here, but I'll leave something on the table so everybody goes and buys another copy of my book. I also think it's time that this generation of planners undertakes a fundamental rethink of the way we do land use planning. So let's talk a little about the keys of local reform. The first and most obvious, again, in a place like Ohio, where there is a lot of amazing historical housing stock just sitting around, great examples of the types of stuff we need to be building, legalize the stuff that you want and legalize the stuff that in many cases you already have. What we need to get back to doing is building the types of missing middle housing, starter homes that historically made our communities affordable and dynamic. You know, today we build neighborhoods and we say, okay, this neighborhood, here are going to be the rules for the homes. They're all going to look identical, and they're always going to look identical until the end of time. Healthy neighborhoods historically didn't work that way. They would incrementally grow and adapt. Maybe on a block of single family homes, a duplex might be built, or a row of townhouses, or a small apartment building. These incremental changes would help to keep communities affordable, diverse, dynamic. And yet in so many contexts today, it's illegal for neighborhoods to follow that very healthy path. I would say this isn't just hypothetical. Part of what we're seeing all across the country is jurisdictions tackling single family zoning and saying in all residential districts, we're going to allow maybe up to fourplexes. We're going to allow townhouses or duplexes. Some jurisdictions, certainly near transit, are saying we'll allow up to sixplexes on any lot. These are just a few examples. And just in the past month, I believe Sacramento and Tacoma both made these changes. This is absolutely key for opening up those huge tracts of our cities that are closed to housing affordability, opening them up to new production. I talked about Minneapolis. Minneapolis made history by being one of the first cities to abolish single-family zoning after adopting it. In the same year, they adopted a general plan which also substantially upzoned their corridors to allow for mid-rise multifamily housing with ground floor commercial. And what they did was they teed themselves up for significant amounts of new housing infill production. And of course, you know, it's hard to draw comparisons here, but this is a set of charts from The Economist where they compared housing production and rent in real terms in Minneapolis relative to nearby peer cities, including Columbus, as well as Cincinnati here. What they found was that Minneapolis, after teeing up a lot of this new infill production, A, saw a lot of new housing being produced in the immediate aftermath, and B, was the only city in this peer group that over the past 5 years or so has had rents fall in real terms. The city made it easier to build infill housing. They did it in a way that actually ensured that new units were getting built. And what they saw was dramatic improvements, I would say, for housing affordability. This is especially key when you think back about that 5% vacancy rate that just seems to be headed further and further down. Or when you think about that home price index that's just going up and up and up. If we're serious about stopping that, I think we have to learn lessons from places like Minneapolis and a growing pool of cities that are doing similar reforms. Right here in California, we saw something similar. Oakland was one of the fastest developing cities in the Bay Area. They permitted significant amounts of new supply, and not incidentally, they're one of the only cities in the region where rents have been held and are likely to fall in real terms. Another exciting local reform that I always like to highlight is townhouse legalization, reducing your minimum lot sizes and allowing for smaller, more affordable homes on smaller lots. Houston, as I'll talk about here in a minute, doesn't have formal zoning, but they have a lot of zoning-like rules. And one of those rules was minimum lot sizes. They had a citywide 5,000 square foot minimum lot size before 1999. In 1998, they adopted a set of reforms allowing homes on lots as small as 1,400 square feet, allowing for new townhouses to be built. By one estimate, this has allowed for something like 80,000 new townhouses to be built, new single-family homes that for the most part are automatically affordable to folks at area median incomes, being built in existing urban areas on existing infrastructure. And this is, I think, key to part of why Houston has remained one of the most affordable major cities in the country. I think if we're serious about creating the next generation of homeowners and closing, for example, wealth gaps, we have to be allowing housing typologies like this, and it starts locally. Many cities are also eliminating their minimum parking requirements. Certainly, this started in cities with a lot of historic urban fabric like Buffalo and Hartford, which said it's crazy that so many of our existing buildings are illegal to reuse or to expand because there's not enough parking. The crisis in these cities, as in so many other cities, is not that there's not enough parking. Indeed, if you go to the typical American city, you'll find huge parking lots that are basically never completely full and many vacant parking lots, as well as buildings that could not be adaptively reused without requesting a variance that will be long and difficult. What Buffalo and Hartford and now many dozens of cities across the country have done is said, well, we're going to eliminate minimum parking requirements, and we're going to actually manage the on-street parking that we have to generate new public revenue and also ensure parking availability. My hometown of Lexington, just down I-75 from you all, eliminated minimum parking requirements citywide just this past year. We also need to be rebuilding our housing safety net. Historically, the housing safety net was developments like single room occupancies. So where you might have a private bedroom with a sink, but maybe a shared bathroom and a shared kitchen. These are not glamorous forms of housing, but they're a significant improvement over having to sleep in your car or sleep in a tent under an overpass. We've made single room occupancy style developments illegal to build in the vast majority of our cities for the past 100 years. We essentially wiped out our natural housing safety net, not incidentally, as we start eliminating single room occupancies in the 70s and 80s, that's when we really start to see the spike in street homelessness. If we're serious about tackling the homelessness crisis, we have to start rebuilding units like this that serve people at the bottom. And again, this is another example from Houston, but many other cities are doing this. Houston in particular has been building a lot of new SROs, getting people immediately rehoused. And not incidentally, they're one of the only major American cities that's on track to eliminate street homelessness. I've talked a lot about the substance of the rules, but there's also a huge amount of benefit to be gained from process improvements. So if you allow, for example, an ADU, but it takes 6 months to get a permit, well, you might as well just not allow an ADU. And I'll talk more about ADUs in a minute. It's absolutely essential that we make permitting processes, especially for these types of housing that might be built by homeowners or might be built by small local contractors, to make them as easy and painless to build as possible. Make the rules really easy. And for certain smaller types of housing, pursue same-day entitlements. As important as local reform is, it's also essential that we have leadership at the state level. One of the things that we've done here, one of our successes in California over the last few years has been the statewide legalization of accessory dwelling units. Depending on where you are, these might be called granny flats, mother-in-law units. These are essentially extra small apartments that go in basements or attics or garages or new structures in the backyard. Since legalizing these statewide in 2017, pursuant to a workable set of regulations, we've now seen essentially a renaissance of new backyard housing being built in California. Across the state, I think we're approaching 100,000 ADUs built in the past 8 years, approaching alone. This is state reformed zoning immediately unlocking a new supply of what we know is inherently affordable housing. Indeed, the typical ADU is rented to a relative at zero or no cost, somebody who might have otherwise had to leave the metro area or live in a living room. We've done a few other things like this in California, legalizing duplexes and small lot homes on many lots. AB 2011 was a win-win. We said we have a lot of commercial corridors that have empty strip malls, empty office parks. Let's allow mixed income multifamily housing. We've also done a lot of process streamlining, saying, look, if housing proposals meet certain rules, follow certain guidelines, they have to be entitled in a ministerial way and subject to certain timelines. this was our 2023 legislative agenda. If you want to fill up your coffee, we'll go through every single one of these. I'm kidding. But there are a lot of different approaches that we're taking to it in California. And the exciting thing about this is this is happening all across the country. It's not a California phenomenon. And it's also not a red or a blue phenomenon, especially. So Texas in this past session passed a bill allowing for third-party review and certification of certain projects if certain timelines aren't met. Meanwhile, back in deep blue Washington, the state legalized duplexes and fourplexes statewide in all single-family zones. Back in a deep red state, Montana this year legalized accessory dwelling units and legalized apartments in all commercial zones. Back in a blue state, Connecticut is streamlining their statewide planning laws to make sure that wealthy jurisdictions can't block any and all new affordable housing. It's a beautiful issue because it's not a red or a blue issue. It's not a conservative or a progressive issue. Some folks might talk about it in terms of property rights or deregulation. Other folks might talk about it in terms of racial equity or sustainability. Be smart about it, talk in terms of people's values, but the ultimate policy objective is the same, that there are certain types of housing that we need to be building and allowing in our communities to advance affordability, equity, and sustainability. Now, of course, the federal government doesn't have a huge role to play in zoning, but the federal government does have a lot of money. And increasingly, we're seeing bills that would condition some of these funds, such as community development block grants or New Start's transit capital grants, conditioning these funds on making progress on zoning reform. As well as just this past year, the federal government allocated $85 million to fund local governments removing these zoning barriers to new housing. I suspect we're going to see more of this, and there's going to be more federal sticks and carrots to encourage local jurisdictions to adopt reform. But I also think there's some potential for us to think big here. We need to take a regional approach to a lot of these issues, and I think we need to do a really good job of making sure that we're addressing the impacts of new growth. I'll talk very briefly about this because I want to get to Q&A. Something that's gone wrong with the way we do planning in the US is that our metro areas are incredibly fragmented. Labor markets and job markets don't stop and start at municipal boundaries. And yet, in a place like metropolitan Columbus, you might have 36 different permitting jurisdictions with 36 different various zoning codes. If that seems bad, I would remind you in Los Angeles, Metro Los Angeles here, I believe we have 88 jurisdictions in our metro area and at least a half dozen counties. This is a crazy way to plan, and I think it's part and parcel of some of the challenges we face. Here in California, we've beefed up our system of the regional housing needs assessment. So saying we're going to make sure that every local government adopts a plan to build at least its fair share, or at least allow its fair share of housing. And I'm happy to talk about more of about that in a minute. At the same time, I think if we want to put these reforms on stable footing, we have to be ensuring that we are addressing the concerns that many people have about new development. So when there was a survey done of Sacramento residents asking them, what are your concerns about new development? I suspect most planners on the call can guess what they found. Folks were concerned about parking and traffic, and then there was everything else. People were incredibly concerned about, am I going to lose my parking space? Am I going to sit in traffic for 10 minutes longer? Those are totally valid concerns. Or when you say to people, hey, let's allow for corner shops again, I think people have totally valid concerns about things like, well, I want a corner grocery, but I really wouldn't want it to be a noisy corner bar. These are real impacts that are valid, and these, to my mind, are the issues that we as planners should be really focusing on. I think of what we do where we add the most value is being stewards of the public realm, not micromanagers of every new project. And there are jurisdictions that I think are doing really exciting things on this score. So here's a new comprehensive plan, general plan, master plan update from Bastrop, Texas. They dispensed with a lot of the historical rigid zoning rules. And they said, look, we have growth that's coming. It can either take that classic American form of that you see on the bottom right here of curling dead end cul-de-sacs that intersect with floodplains, or we can just sit out and come up with a grid plan of growth that is going to be reasonable and equitable and direct growth away from environmentally sensitive areas. To my mind, this is where we as planners add the most value, when we set up institutions and rules that mean that new growth will enrich the lives of current residents rather than degrade it. And I think to the extent that we've not figured that out, I think many people are understandably concerned about growth, and it's going to be absolutely essential that we tackle that head on in the coming years. I'll wrap up very briefly here. Another slide I've added just to beat some of the lessons into folks here. The bare minimum of zoning reform, I think, today: legalize accessory dwelling units, remove your minimum parking requirements, legalize mixed-use multifamily in your commercial districts and on your corridors, reduce or eliminate your minimum lot sizes that are untethered from health and safety mandates, and expand ministerial approvals. Make it really easy for good local developers to build good projects. What can you do? If you're an elected official or commissioner, be the champion that your community needs on housing and land use reform. In many cases, this is, if you survey people now, increasingly Americans are saying their number one issue is housing affordability, or the cost of living, which is tied up with mobility. Be that leader that in many cases constituents are demanding. If you're a planner or a developer, be a policy entrepreneur. People look to you. You're the expert in the room. Be ready with the reforms in mind and the materials needed to back them up. And if you're just an activist, which I hope everybody on this call is an activist in some sense, ask those folks above what we're doing on housing. Be ready, build the coalitions, provide folks cover to do the right thing. It can be tough if you're a lone planner in your office trying to pursue reform, or if you're the only member of your city council exploring reform on these issues. Activists need to back those folks up and be at the meetings and speak on behalf of these absolutely necessary reforms. Every single person on this call has some role to play in the reform here. With that, I went a little bit long, but I'm more than happy to take questions, and I would love it if folks would reach out. And yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks. We do have some questions coming in. The first one, I think, is just super top shelf. And I see that your California YIMBY logo, and it makes me think that the whole issue, not the whole, a major part of the issue of the zoning that we have today has a lot to do with misinformation. How do we get people, citizens? No, I'm not even talking about elected officials. I'm just talking about the community. How do we get them to shift their viewpoint on what is housing, what is safe housing, you know, what they want in their neighborhood? So the people think they know what they want, but how do we shift the perspective and create a whole new culture? And I know this is a ginormous question, but I think it's sort of at the very top.
You know, how do we create a new culture? That's a big question, and I'm not sure. But how do we shift attitudes toward housing and zoning? One of the most effective mechanisms I've found is you take folks to that great pre-zoning neighborhood that already exists, right? And this is a challenge in some parts of the country, but it's very much not a challenge in Ohio. Every city in Ohio has great neighborhoods that have a mixture of typologies, where maybe the homes sit close to the street, where there's a corner barber shop or a corner doctor's office. And in many cases, those are now increasingly some of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. You take people to those neighborhoods and then you say, why would we have rules on the books that make it illegal to build more neighborhoods like this? Why would we want rules on the books that make it harder to turn maybe that dying post-war suburb into something more dynamic and interesting like this neighborhood? And I think when you put it in if you approach somebody and start talking about floor area ratios or setbacks, if they don't just immediately politely walk away, they're going to imagine Hong Kong, right? You have to meet people where they're at and show them, hey, what we're talking about legalizing is something that already exists in our community and that is cherished and beloved and usually subject to a historic preservation ordinance. When people see what you're talking about, when they see what missing middle means, or when they see what a mixed use, mixed income neighborhood looks like, the concerns, I think, start to melt away.
Yeah. And folks, if you have questions, just type them into the box. Do you feel that PUDs have a place in a zoning code today, or should they be eliminated?
To my mind, PUDs are a kludge, like many of the other discretionary tools that we have. Do I oppose variances or rezonings in most cases? No, but ideally we're doing the long-term planning work to say, here are the clear rules to allow the specific types of developments that we're comfortable with. So, while I totally understand why jurisdictions become dependent on PUDs because maybe they don't want to undertake the work of fixing the zoning code in the first place, or having a long-term plan for growth. Those are very difficult things to do. They get stuck on PUDs, and that ends up involving a huge amount of paperwork. It becomes very difficult, of course, whenever you want to change the PUD. Anyone who's ever interacted with a PUD on this call doesn't need me to explain the sort of bureaucratic paperwork nightmare that they can quickly become. And so I would say, to the extent that we can maybe change some of the underlying rules that are encouraging developers to always want to do a PUD, and say, write rules that are actually workable and satisfy community concerns in a more ministerial, straightforward way, I would say that's the desirable way to approach it.
You talked early in your presentation about talking about what housing can look like, how to remove the various stigmas of housing types. In what kind of setting can we start those conversations? Where should they begin? Do they begin with the community events? Like, do you start, some kind of meetings with elected officials? Where do we begin the conversation?
That's a really great question. I found that for many YIMBY groups specifically, it just starts with folks meeting maybe for a happy hour or a breakfast. And it's realizing, okay, there are other urbanists in my community. There are other people who are passionate about reform in my community. That sort of gets you your base of people who are they're already converted, right? But for new people, I think it's doing that type of outreach work that I was just discussing, taking people on walks and showing them, especially around your neighborhoods where there might be great, highly desirable built form that would be illegal to build today, and take them on a walk and show them, hey, here's how we could change some of our rules to get more duplexes like that, or here's how we could change our rules to get more small, inherently affordable single family homes, or more of the infill multifamily that we needed. Taking people on walks, showing them specifically examples of what could and what has been built. Don't talk in terms of FAR and setback and leave it up to the imagination. I would also say too, in terms of messaging, I think we've kind of taken a take your medicine approach to these issues, right? We say like, well, sorry, there are all these historical injustices and the earth is on fire, so we have to allow like a mixture of housing typologies near parks, and maybe you can bike to work someday. I wouldn't frame that as like, oh, here's an unfortunate thing we have to do. I would frame that as, wouldn't it be great if our community had enough housing to where nobody's struggling to make rent? Wouldn't it be great if you had a range of housing typologies? So maybe when you're a young professional, you can live in an apartment. And then when you have a big family, there's a townhouse that's ready for you. And then when you want to downsize, you can move into a duplex with young adult children and have them nearby. When you frame things in terms of giving people choice and options, to my mind, it starts to become more desirable than saying, well, things are bad and we have to do this thing because it's bad. Of course, there's no point in sugarcoating it, that certainly the elements of where zoning codes are advancing segregation, you do have to, I think it can be very effective in certain contexts to make that story clear. But I think broadly it's appealing if you say, look, we could have nice things if we make some of these changes. That to me inspires people more than maybe browbeating them.
A couple questions about accessory dwelling units. And this one question in particular kind of struck me, and maybe I just haven't thought about it the right way. When I think of an ADU, I think of, oh, grandma and grandpa are coming to live with us, because, we know that's a whole other conversation about, aging in place, or, housing for the retired and the elderly. But this question says, have areas that implemented ADUs been successful in decreasing homelessness? Have those utilizing an ADU been able to graduate to home ownership? In other words, is there data of the success of ADUs in various issues? And I guess what struck me about it is my perception of ADUs, and I'm in the middle of it, right? And here I am thinking like, oh, well, an ADU, it's just a family member, right? And they probably just stay there. But not thinking about, well, wait a minute, there's a lot more to ADUs than just grandma and grandpa, living above the garage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we know from California, some early data, is most ADUs are rented out. The modal rent is $0, and it's somebody exactly renting to aging parents or young adult children, right? Or maybe relatives who are need some support for any given reason, right? Caretakers, very common situation. So folks who are caring for children with development disabilities, but they want to keep them close, but they still have to look out for them, or certainly in the case of parents who need to be cared for. That seems to be the typical case. But many ADUs are rented out. Indeed, this is another really valuable thing for ADUs. What we find is that maybe homeowners who want to age in place, but need an additional source of income will build an ADU and then rent it out. This is in part why, for example, the AARP is such a great ally on this issue, because this allows people to age in place. As far as homelessness and graduating into homeownership, not a lot of great data on this yet. Here in California, more jurisdictions are rolling out programs to encourage deed restricted affordable ADUs. So for example, in San Diego, pursuant to state law, you can build an ADU. But if you build a second ADU that's deed restricted affordable to households earning at or just below the median income, you're entitled to build a third ADU in certain areas of the city. And so what you're seeing is now folks are maybe having what is essentially a little cottage cluster. And some of those units are deed restricted affordable, and those are serving households that might need some support, and giving them stable housing and potentially teaming them up to move on and graduate into homeownership.
I think we have time for one more question. Regarding historic preservation, as you mentioned, Ohio is filled with wonderful historic districts. Many of them are nationally and state recognized. So the question is, how can you overcome development barriers in or right around historic districts? Sometimes they can be extreme or considered to be a barrier working within a historic district or adjacent to. And there might be some missed opportunities for development. And how can we work with that?
Absolutely. That's a really, really great question. And that's a big challenge here in California. I mean, something we've seen in California, as in so many parts of the country, is NIMBYs misusing preservation, fairly explicitly trying to get a historic district adopted with the purpose of blocking infill housing. And I think I work with many great preservationists who would say that's not how preservation should work, and it's not how we want it to work. And there actually does have to be a lot of latitude for additional infill, even in our historic places. And it can be infill that reinforces the context and character of those neighborhoods. But I think to say we preserve a neighborhood by locking it as it exists today, I think that's a very superficial understanding of what it means to preserve a neighborhood, and that in many cases, truly preserving a neighborhood means continuing to allow the process of change and growth and adaptation that made that great neighborhood what it was in the first place. So it is a challenge. I think we need to be aware of this, and I think it's an emerging issue. Certainly, as we take some of the exclusionary zoning tools out of the NIMBY toolbox, folks try to misuse other mechanisms, and we have to be careful about it. Certainly something we're thinking about here in California.
In the chat, I just put in a link to another YouTube video. I'm sure you're all familiar with the planning webcast series that all of our Ohio members have access to. Just about every Friday, we have a webinar on a different topic, and they're all good for CM credit and they're free. One of them from this past year talked about historic preservation as a means for providing affordable housing, sustainability, and equity, all the things. And it was really good. And it actually kind of took a curve, and there was a pretty big discussion around parking in historic districts and converting buildings to apartments. And what does that do for parking? All the things. Anyway, copy that YouTube link and check it out if that's something that interests you. It is 1 o'clock Eastern time, so we have to wrap up. Nolan, I'm so glad we were able to connect and you're doing well. And we appreciate you coming back and joining us. And of course, if you didn't get a copy of Nolan's book, I'm sure I know it's out there on Amazon. It's at all the bookstores, but I highly recommend it. It was really good. And we're recording the session. So you'll get a link to our YouTube channel for that. And don't forget to log your CM credits. So everyone, thank you for joining us. Nolan, thank you. Eric, you're back there. Thank you too. Everyone, happy holidays. and thanks for joining us. Have a good one.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Great session.
Yay. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Anything
that
we need
was
to chat
great,
about,
and-
or are we good?
No, we're good. I'm just waiting. Allison's gonna jump on. We're gonna talk treasurer stuff real quick.
Ooh.
If anybody follows up, don't hesitate to share my email. And I'm
Oh,
happy to
absolutely. Oh, good. Thank
happy to
you.
chat.